Portraits promise majesty, yet the brush cannot show brittleness woven through a dynasty. For centuries, marriages were treaties, and treaties were fences against rivals, not consultations with physicians. What happens when a state manages borders expertly but treats biology like an obedient servant? Courtiers praised purity, diplomats tallied dowries, and priests blessed unions that quietly narrowed genetic variety. Rumors raced ahead of medicine, translating ordinary childhood ailments into omens about empire and eternity. This story refuses sensational nicknames and lurid diagnosis by retrospect. It follows documents, incentives, and constraints. Charles II entered a world where family trees looped back on themselves with unnerving neatness. The goal was stability, the cost was resilience, paid in small installments across generations. As anxiety grew, people reached for miracles, talismans, and blame, because mystery invites mythology. The near consequence was policy distortion. Superstition competed with stewardship, and reputation management replaced patient care. Treating a body as a constitutional variable made governance reactive, theatrical, and permanently distracted. If we chase spectacle, we miss the system that produced fragile heirs and frantic ministers. The humane approach centers dignity, explains uncertainty plainly, and resists turning symptoms into sideshow. Our lens, then, is structural: marriage strategy, medical capacity, and administrative choices under pressure. Bridge: begin with the proud motto, Bella Garant Alii, tu Felix Austria Nub, and its unintended arithmetic. Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. A policy slogan masquerading as destiny. Habsburg power compounded through contracts, dowries, and dispensations, knitting Europe's elites into dense dependency. Could any court that managed maps so shrewdly truly believe chromosomes would obey diplomacy? Each triumph invited another intra-family match, praised as prudence, normalized by ritual, and insulated from critique. The strategy lowered invasion risk while quietly raising inheritance risk, a ledger few officials kept. Theology blessed continuity. Heraldry mapped alliances. Physicians, lacking tools, rarely refereed these political intimacies. Decision makers optimized for predictability, yet predictability in mating reduces the very variability health requires. Over time, ancestral lines converged, shrinking the reservoir of protective genes available to future children. That convergence did not guarantee catastrophe, but it increased the odds and narrowed escape routes. When trouble surfaced, blame looked outward. Witchcraft, enemies, or God's displeasure, anything except structural arithmetic. The near consequence was fragility behind pageantry, a dynasty strong on parchment, weak in physiology, and fragility at the top refracted downward, shaping councils, budgets, and diplomatic reflexes toward overcompensation. A wiser design would have diversified kinships the way prudent states diversify allies and grain. Instead, habit hardened, and habit wrote tomorrow's christening speeches with yesterday's assumptions intact. Bridge: zoom into the pedigree itself, closed loops, repeated surnames, and an inbreeding coefficient that raises eyebrows. Pedigree charts loop like ivy, returning to the same names with uneasy regularity. Parish records, dispensations, and heraldic notebooks reveal marriages that tightened kin more than broadened kinships. What resilience can a lineage retain when grandparents share grandparents and branches braid back on themselves? Gene pools thrive on variety. Courts, however, prize predictability, confusing familiarity with safety and permanence. Repetition entered like polite habit, then settled as policy, protected by ceremony and flattered by theology. A brief editorial note helps. Probability is not prophecy, yet it punishes systems that ignore arithmetic. Midwives noticed patterns. Physicians muttered caution, but ministers treated caution as unhelpful to diplomacy. Each generation narrowed options further, converting romantic myths into administrative commitments difficult to unwind gracefully. Chroniclers praised continuity while leaving footnotes about cousins, dispensations, and convenient definitions of sufficiently distant. The paperwork reads tidy, the biology reads constrained, especially where childhood illnesses test inherited reserves. Near consequence followed. Vulnerability concentrated at the very node expected to anchor stability for everyone else. Such concentration bent counsels toward magical thinking, because evidence offered discomfort and habit offered relief. A wiser dynasty would have diversified marriages as it diversified revenue, routes, and grain. Instead, the map of kinship stayed dense, priming later anxieties to overrun medicine and prudence. Bridge: Step into infancy and childhood, where routine infections became omens and rumor outpaced diagnosis. Nurses traded sleepless nights with priests and physicians, calibrating hope against fevers that returned. Milestones arrived late or unevenly, the kind of delays that frighten families and embolden gossips. How should a court respond when a child's ordinary stumbles are read as national prophecies? Tutors softened lessons, doctors prescribed rest, and courtiers broadcast optimism to keep markets calm. Household journals mix tenderness with anxiety, noting ailments without modern language for mechanism or prognosis. A brief editorial aside, early records describe outcomes, not etiologies. Humility is better than retrospective theatrics. Diplomatic letters began weighing symptoms alongside subsidies because vassals watch health more than heraldry. Rumor braided church, clinic, and council, turning private uncertainties into parables about destiny and sin. Servants learned discretion, midwives learned blame, visiting dignitaries learned to ask questions with padded edges. Near consequence surfaced quickly. Governance drifted toward spectacle, since reassurance felt easier than investment in capability. Resources favored ceremonies promising strength over institutions delivering care, a familiar but costly diversion. Anxiety trained the palace to prefer talismans, while physicians negotiated access through etiquette, not evidence. That training would haunt adulthood, shaping marriages, regencies, and how medicine competed with ritual for attention. Yet the child remained a child, deserving dignity, not caricature, in public and posterity. Bridge. Enter boyhood politics, where schooling, ritual, and reputation turned health into a daily referendum. Boyhood unfolded under choreography, catechism at dawn, tutors by noon, and audiences staged for reassurance. Processions trained muscles and memory, while heralds taught posture that promised continuity despite private frailty. What happens when a child's gait, complexion, or silence becomes a barometer for treasury and treaties? Court painters softened angles, chroniclers trimmed worries, and festivals lengthened to advertise inexhaustible vigor. Godparents were selected like alliances, their names intended to stabilize markets as much as souls. An editorial aside helps. Spectacle can calm a week, yet it often mortgages the year. Teachers adjusted curricula to energy, testing patience more than mastery, prioritizing presence over performance. Diplomats watched recitals closely, noting stamina, voice, and exit timing like traders reading weather. Rumor translated coughs into portents, while rivals rehearsed condolences that doubled as opportunistic invitations. Physicians proposed schedules rather than mechanisms, because access depended on etiquette, not laboratory instruments. The household protected dignity, but protection required storycraft, and storycraft required cooperative witnesses. Near consequence followed. Policy tethered itself to appearances, elevating optics above investment in durable capacity. Bureaucrats learned to manage mood before managing risk, a habit extraordinarily costly in crisis. The prince, meanwhile, learned survival skills, measured speech, careful smiles, and strategic retreat to unobserved rooms. Those habits preserved privacy, yet starved diagnosis, pushing medicine behind veils of ceremony and hope. Bridge. Carry that training into adolescence, where recurring illnesses tangled diaries, calendars, and administrative patience. Adolescence arrived with fevers, infections, and recoveries that left stamina patchy and confidants protective. Records list episodes unevenly because clerks prioritize protocol, not clinical granularity or experimental verification. How should history treat scattered notes without converting uncertainty into confident, theatrical diagnosis? We begin with humility, describing courses and intervals, not retrofitting syndromes from modern vocabulary. Journals report headaches, weakness, and absences from councils, yet motives and mechanisms remain partly opaque. A measured aside matters. Multiple illnesses can coexist. Single cause explanations flatter narratives more than biology. Treatments ranged from purges and poultices to pious rest, guided by tradition rather than controlled comparison. Courtiers tracked good days like victories, then overpromised, teaching ministers to adjust calendars, not capacity. Repeated convalescence delayed apprenticeships in statecraft, narrowing the practice window before adult responsibilities hardened. Near consequence emerged quickly. Governance leaned on regents and secretaries, growing factions that equated access with authority. That substitution preserved continuity, yet incubated rival timelines where rumors outran physicians and budgets. Foreign observers read the gaps creatively, attributing setbacks to poisons, curses, or cosmic displeasure. Supernatural language comforted frightened elites because it blamed enemies, not cherished marriage policy. Skilled practitioners requested patience and privacy. Politics delivered deadlines and audiences instead of instruments. When medicine loses initiative, ritual takes the stage and hires confidence in its place. Bridge, those conditions birthed a nickname, El Hechizado, and a market for relics, rites, and theatrical cures. A nickname gathered mass, El Hechizado, shorthand for fears that doctrine couldn't easily soothe. Courtiers scheduled blessings, processions, and exorcisms, careful to frame each rite as prudent housekeeping. Reliquaries traveled like ambassadors. Astrologers consulted charts that promised auspicious hours and safer thresholds. What do ceremonies repair when the underlying problem is arithmetic written into pedigrees? Rituals reassured onlookers, externalizing blame toward demons, rivals, or heaven's temporary displeasure. That reassurance preserved hierarchy, because invisible enemies demand loyal unity and disciplined silence. Priests meant consolation. Ministers needed stability. Both aims were sincere, though strategically convenient. Our stance refuses mockery. Belief can comfort sufferers, and dignity matters more than derision. Yet belief repurposed as policy discourages measurement, turning exceptions into rules that resist revision. Suppliers of sanctity gained influence, while cautious physicians lost initiative behind perfume protocols. Foreign envoys read the incense, concluding governance preferred omen management to infrastructure or clinics. The near consequence was diversion. Time, budgets, and attention drifted from capability toward repeatable spectacle. Citizens learned to narrate misfortune morally, which simplifies politics but complicates medicine and mercy. Destigmatizing the king means naming the system honestly without ridiculing the faithful who cared. Responsible narration holds both truths together. Comfort can be kind, and policy must be testable. Bridge. From sanctuaries to surgeries, follow the period's medicine, where tradition overshadowed comparison and replication. Court medicine spoke humors and balance. Barbers bled, apothecaries mixed, and physicians prescribed rest. Germs were unnamed, microscopes were curiosities. Trials compared reputations more than outcomes. When access outranks evidence, what guides treatment besides etiquette, habit, and hopeful authority? Standard kits included purges, emetics, cuppings, poultices, cordials, bezoars, theriac, and aromatic airs. Some remedies soothed by chance, others exhausted patients already rationing energy across ceremonies and councils. A measured aside matters. Practitioners worked with the best frameworks available, not with malice. Still, frameworks without falsification become fortresses, protecting hypotheses from the rainy weather of reality. Records show dosage debates, calendar adjustments, and deference arranged like furniture around the bed. Consultations multiplied, but replication lagged since privacy, prestige, and piety discouraged controlled, comparable observation. Pharmacy mirrored politics. Supply chains privileged courtiers, while provincial talent seldom reached decisive rooms. Near consequence followed. Iatrogenic harm blurred with illness, and credibility eroded whenever promises outran recovery. Quacks prospered beside experts, because confidence performs better than caveats in frightened audiences. A healthier system would have gated interventions by reproducible benefit, not proximity or ceremonial rank. It also would have protected downtime, since sleep and nutrition outperformed most fashionable tonics. These lessons aren't hindsight scorn. They're scaffolding for empathy and sober institutional critique. Bridge. Step from bedside to cabinet, where regents and factions managed a kingdom around a fragile monarch. Regency gathered under painted ceilings, where Mariana of Austria balanced piety with arithmetic. Councils convened in careful sequences, each agenda trimmed to what her stamina could carry. How does a cabinet govern when access to the sovereign is rationed by health and ceremony? Secretaries learned to translate symptoms into schedules, and schedules into policy shaped by scarcity. Factions formed around doorways, since proximity decided which memos reached signatures before dusk. Worth noting, loyalists and critics both claimed stewardship, yet their incentives diverged at budget lines. Revenue lagged behind obligations, armies waited for pay, and governors begged relief from distant desks. Ministers rebranded delay as prudence, rotating communiques that promised improvement without falsifiable milestones. Diplomacy adjusted tone, offering condolences wrapped around requests, while rivals tested borders discreetly. The regent's restraint avoided shocks, but incrementalism accumulated risks no decree could suddenly dissolve. Near consequence followed. Governance became defensive, rewarding courtiers who managed mood rather than measurable outcomes. That reward structure favored appearances over repairs, especially where repairs required candor about structural fragility. Still, the machinery kept moving, proving institutions can endure while their center remains delicate. Endurance, however, is not direction, and drift eventually arrived, disguised as compromise and courtesy. To reset direction, advisors pinned hopes on continuity through childbirth, the oldest policy tool available. Bridge, enter the first marriage, where love, diplomacy, and medicine collided beneath the pressure of succession. Marie Louise crossed the Pyrenees into expectations scripted long before she learned the stage. Vows joined families and treaties, then quietly recruited her body into the kingdom's fiscal math. What happens to tenderness when a nursery is treated as a balancing column in ledgers? Courtiers prescribed pilgrimages, physicians recommended rest, and confessors urged patience shaped like ritual. Gifts arrived, relics, recipes, and regimens, each endorsed by someone powerful, none tested by comparison. It bears stating, infertility is not a failing, and assigning blame compounds grief with stigma. Yet rooms full of hope often drift toward guilt, because hope dislikes uncertainty's open ends. Diaries record kind gestures and heavy silence, a rhythm familiar to households under watch. Ambassadors wrote discreet updates, their margins filled with timelines, rumors, and carefully hedged predictions. Markets noticed the hedging, pricing volatility into contracts, while ministers rephrased delays as dignified caution. Near consequence appeared quickly. Pressure migrated from clinics to chapels, then back again without resolution. The couple protected privacy where possible, but privacy thinned under the weight of impatient ceremony. Even celebrations acquired subtext, since toast to health sounded like audits disguised as compliments. A wiser polity would have widened compassion and diversified plans beyond one fragile contingency. Instead, expectation narrowed further, and every month stretched like an argument no one could win. Bridge. Public disappointment soon hardened into commentary, shaping reputation at home and abroad after repeated miscarried hopes. Failure to conceive became a chorus line, sung softly in courts and loudly in alleys. Praise shifted to pity, then to suspicion, the familiar arc of publics under strain. How should a nation talk about private sorrow when budgets and borders depend on heirs? Envoys relayed condolences with arithmetic beneath the ink, tallying factions and alternative futures. Pamphleteers filled gaps with fables, assigning fault to appetites, saints, or poisons on convenient timelines. A brief editorial aside, stigma masquerades as analysis whenever evidence is scarce and pressure high. Physicians proposed gentler regimens, while confidence vendors hawked relics that promised seasonal miracles. Each remedy arrived with a patron, which made polite refusal feel politically expensive. Court painters worked overtime, crafting images of health that markets read as hedged bets. The palace tightened etiquette, hoping fewer eyes meant fewer interpretations and slower rumor cycles. Near consequence followed quickly. Reputation management displaced hard investment in clinics, midwifery, and public health. Europe's salons learned a phrase, fragile Spain, and repeated it until it sounded like geography. That phrase affected credit, recruitment, and leverage, because adjectives travel faster than troop convoys. Compassion eroded into commentary, and commentary hardened into posture that narrowed diplomatic options. Yet inside the marriage, patience persisted, though it could not repurpose longing into biology. When patience failed politics, strategy reached for precedent, new vows, new hopes, and renewed theater. Bridge. The court arranged another alliance with Maria Anna, expecting continuity from a different constellation. Maria Anna arrived with stalwart pedigree, careful manners, and a household trained for fragile contexts. Contracts promised dowries and friendship, unspoken clauses outsourced fertility to prayer, regimen, and luck. Can repeating a strategy with new names escape the arithmetic that undermined the earlier match? The answer hid in incentives. Diplomats needed ceremony, while physicians needed tools they mostly lacked. Courtiers refreshed schedules, swapping talismans and tonics while rehearsing optimism for attentive ambassadors. A brief editorial note helps. Repetition feels like prudence when alternatives threaten status and face. Initial months brought cautious smiles, then familiar silences that etiquette translated into await further news. Letters from Vienna and Rome mixed condolences with counsel, and counsel with quiet leverage. The couple guarded dignity, yet privacy thinned as calendars again became public property. Ministers claimed steadiness, publishing bulletins that praised restraint while announcing nothing falsifiable or new. Near consequence was administrative drift. Policies stalled, rivals probed, and budgets ballooned, chasing reversible delays. Markets priced uncertainty into loans, while governors improvised, widening the gap between center and frontier. Superstition reasserted itself politely, offering chants and journeys whose benefits escaped measurement or replication. Even so, respect demands we name grief without performance, and uncertainty without ridicule. A wiser state would have diversified succession contingencies rather than doubling bets on biology. Instead, the kingdom tightened the circle and waited, patient and publicly confident, privately exhausted. Bridge. With disappointment recurring, attention shifted to information flows, how gossip, medicine, and policy fed one another. Couriers crossed frontiers with letters that mixed bedside notes, theology, and budget requests. News arrived unevenly, so ministers filled gaps with inference, then defended inference like evidence. How does a government choose calmly when its information diet blends rumor with ritual and hope? Physicians wrote cautiously, envoys wrote strategically, and confessors wrote as guardians of morale and order. Their genres clashed, yet councils stitched them together, creating policy quilts that looked coherent from distance. A small editorial aside helps. Archives preserve intention better than accuracy when incentives reward reassurance. Ledgers show hospitals underfunded while shrines received candles, because candles reported success more theatrically. Memo traffic reveals feedback loops. Gossip shaped visits. Visits shaped reports. Reports shaped decrees. Critics at court saw the loop and called for method, not more memoranda. The near consequence was administrative whiplash. Clinics opened, stalled, and rebranded without standardized evaluation. Provinces learned to game tone, writing the optimism that secured funds rather than the truth that fixed problems. Diplomacy reacted to mood swings, calibrating offers to the latest bulletin rather than durable capacity. Responsible narration notes that many acted in good faith. The system still produced noise. A wiser design would separate comfort from measurement, so compassion stops competing with verification. Until then, policy remained a mirror for rumor, polished daily and fragile under stress. Bridge. Now, watch governance itself. Strain. Representation, revenue, and regiments arranged around a monarch's limited stamina. Modern studies suggest clusters rather than a single tidy label for the king's ailments. Some scholars model combined pituitary hormone deficiency. Others consider distal renal tubular acidosis with compounding stressors. What can we responsibly claim when sources describe outcomes but rarely mechanisms with reproducible detail? Start with humility. Symptoms overlap across disorders, and treatments, then obscured trajectories we now try to parse. Facial morphology, often caricatured, belongs to family variants and does not license mockery or certainty. A measured aside helps. Eponyms like Habsburg jaw are descriptors, not diagnoses, and demand respectful language. Researchers triangulate baptismal notes, autopsy rumors, and diet records, grading each piece by provenance. Modeling can illuminate plausibilities without converting conjecture into verdicts or stigma into narrative glue. Where tests cannot be run, ethics must carry more weight than confident speculation or cliquish novelty. The near consequence for storytelling is clear. Avoid medical theater, cite uncertainty, and foreground dignity consistently. Doing so protects living communities who share conditions from becoming props in historical entertainment. It also keeps focus on institutions, marriage policy, healthcare capacity, and administration, where remedies actually live. The aim is not to solve a case, but to improve our reading of systems. Precision about limits makes conclusions sturdier and compassion easier to practice in classrooms. Bridge. With biomedical caution in place, widen back to policy. How strategy made fragility a geopolitical risk. Marriage strategy traded short-term diplomatic certainty for long-term biological volatility in the ruling line. Networks thickened within kin, concentrating risk where redundancy would have served the realm better. Can an empire hedge armies and treasuries yet leave succession exposed to compounding, predictable fragility? Alliances locked provinces into peace, but lock-in also narrowed options for corrective matches. Ministers optimized for today's treaty, while tomorrow's nursery inherited the math of those signatures. A brief editorial note: robustness requires diversity of crops, ports, creditors, and yes, consorts. Because incentives favored continuity, reforms looked like disloyalty, and experiments looked like insult to allies. That culture turned prudence into imitation, a loop palace's mistake for wisdom when storms are distant. Near consequence appeared in procurement, recruitment, and tax collection, all strained by intermittent leadership bandwidth. Rivals probed during convalescences, friends demanded guarantees, governors stockpiled autonomy as insurance against surprise. The costliest effect was strategic myopia, managing reactions rather than reshaping constraints through infrastructural investment. A stronger play would have diversified lines and professionalized care with verifiable standards across regions. That path required candor about arithmetic, something ceremony resists even in kinder, quieter courts. The bill came due regardless, itemized in a will, a deathbed, and a continent's map. Bridge. Follow those items into succession, where documents collided and great powers reached for pens and sabers. The last illness concentrated attention, factions rehearsed condolences, and notaries prepared for heavy afternoons. A will named futures that other wills and treaties contested before ink had fully dried. What do states reach for when biology ends debate and politics begins it at once? They reach for alliances, legalisms, and the arithmetic of cousins with armies behind them. France and Austria advanced claims in dignified tones, while diplomats counted regiments under candlelight. Spain's councils weighed oaths against survival, choosing a path that promised continuity with outside backing. A sober aside, choices at death compressed decades of drift into days of spectacle and calculation. The near consequence was volatile stability, a successor recognized, then challenged, as neighbors measured appetite and risk. Ports braced, treasuries borrowed, and bishops preached unity while quartermasters purchased powder and shoes. Provinces pledged obedience unevenly, bargaining privileges that turned maps into mosaics of conditional loyalty. The childlessness that sat in families now reconfigured Europe's floor plan with ferocious administrative energy. Contingency plans aged into war plans, then marched as ambassadors sent their final friendly notes. This was not destiny, it was design plus denial, arriving together by courier and drum. The succession crisis therefore became a continental question, answered in sieges, treaties, and exhausted budgets. Bridge. Watch the answers harden into treaties that redrew borders and redistributed imperial burdens. Campaigns bled into congresses. Forts surrendered to paragraphs stamped with wax and witnessed by kings. Settlements fixed a Bourbon in Madrid while trimming ambitions to appease balancing coalitions. How do treaties repair stability without cementing new fragilities that future ministers must unwind? By trading concessions, seas here, strongholds there, and by recognizing limits previously masked by ceremony. Utrecht and Rastatt reduced a patchwork of claims to manageable quarrels with scheduled venues. Trade reopened cautiously. Navies recalculated stations. Customs houses learned new arithmetic for flags and fees. A brief editorial note. Maps record outcomes, not lessons. Lessons live in memos and memories. Europe gained breathable equilibrium, yet Spain inherited decades of fiscal and administrative rehabilitation. Provinces adapted to revised privileges, courts rebranded continuity, soldiers sought peacetime stipends and tolerable postings. The near consequence was social. Veterans returned to stretched parishes, artisans to disrupted markets. Over time, reforms professionalized offices, though patronage competed stubbornly with exam and merit. The dynasty's story, retold, edged away from legends toward inventories of arsenals, schools, and roads. Citizens cared less about pedigrees and more about wheat, wages, and predictable justice. That shift remains fragile wherever spectacle tempts rulers to substitute performance for planning again. Bridge, close now with ethics, how to narrate such lives without turning pain into entertainment. Responsible history escorts curiosity with care, especially where illness, stigma, and power intersect. Begin by declaring uncertainty, protecting dignity, and resisting metaphors that collapse people into pathologies. What serves audiences better? Vivid rumor that flatters bias, or transparent methods that humble certainty? We prefer the latter. State sources weigh confidence and separate comfort from measurement in conclusions. Avoid carnival language about bodies. Prefer structures, incentives, and choices that policy can actually change. Teachers can model this by grading clarity over shock and by normalizing, we don't know. Editors can ask for provenance notes. Producers can refuse thumbnails that mind suffering for clicks. The near consequence is cultural. Discourse cools, trust thickens, and reform conversations stop tripping over spectacle. Compassion scales when stories name systems, not scapegoats, and keep sufferers human at every turn. That compassion does not sanitize harm. It clarifies responsibility and guards against recycled cruelty. In this case, the lesson travels: diversify alliances and marriages, upgrade medicine, publish standards, adopt feedback loops that test claims, and fund quiet competence before crisis monetizes panic. Such habits make states sturdier and classrooms kinder, a double dividend worth protecting. We owe past lives more than fascination. We owe them patience and proportion. Bridge. With that ethic, we can close, summing near consequences and opening toward the next inquiry. Strategy made marriages. Marriages made arithmetic. Arithmetic made governance fragile at the very center. Rumor filled the gaps that medicine and administration could not yet competently close. If spectacle becomes policy, what protects citizens besides luck, loyal clerks, and patient teachers? The near consequences persist. Stigma diverts care, speed flatters power, and certainty outruns proof in loud rooms. A humane reading slows the pace. Declare limits, destigmatize bodies, and demand procedures that survive pressure. It points reform toward infrastructure, standards, and diversified kinships rather than talismans or theatrical decrees. That shift makes budgets saner, diplomacy steadier, and classrooms safer for difficult stories. It also honors individuals whose names anchor our analysis without reducing them to symptoms or myths. The invitation ahead is practical. Apply this lens to other dynastic projects built on matrimonial calculus. Ask where variety was sacrificed, where evidence was ignored, and where ceremony replaced measurement. Track which incentives rewarded honesty and which rewarded confidence vendors with polished Latin. Then argue for institutions that keep care boring and justice verifiable when headlines heat. If we learn to value dull competence, legends will shrink and citizens will breathe easier. Bridge to next episode: another marriage market, another empire's bet, and the arithmetic we can still improve.